Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Racing or bracing? That was the question lingering on everyone's mind in the Middle East and beyond throughout the last 2 weeks, following the 1-2 punch suffered by Iran's proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas in both Beirut and Tehran, with senior leaders assassinated by Israel, whether it acknowledged it or not. The threats were explicit, making the intended targeted nation wonder not if it was going to be hit, but rather when, where, how, and what sort of counterstrike to prepare. So while the Israeli population has been bracing itself for the double Shiite retaliation, foreign officials were racing to avert escalation, especially with the conclusion of a hostage release and ceasefire deal up in the air. Joining us to discuss the latest and implications of what I just highlighted, all the way from London, the UK, is retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, who formerly served as a senior director at the National Security Council in Washington, D.C. for Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, as well as U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, currently the founding director of the American Center for Levant Studies. It's good to see you, Colonel.
Good to be with you.
It's a pleasure indeed. Also joining us from Central Israel is Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kuperwasser, formerly served as Director General for the Israeli Ministry for Strategic Affairs, the head of the IDF Intelligence Directorate's Research and Assessment, and currently, of course, he is the Director of the Project for Middle East Developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. It's good to see you, General.
My pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to have both of you indeed. Also with me in the studio, of course, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set the stage for us.
Well, you know, Jonathan, I must share with you the image which comes up, at least to my mind, when we speak about racing. And the image is from the quite old movie, They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Where some poor, hungry people during the Great Depression had to dance, to run until the music stopped and the last couple standing or collapsing won. And it seems as if over these 2 weeks, the Iranians were not really racing, they were crawling, or just like Noah Lyles in the Olympic Games, coming in third because he had COVID, and again collapsing on the finish line. And they are stuck with their threats. They can't really go back because they will lose face. So they are looking for an excuse to delay or even to avoid it. The latest one being that if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, they will rethink the implementation of the threat, because after all, yes, it happened in their own guest house, under their own auspices, in an official event, or just after an official event. But they don't want to lose their precious assets just because a Palestinian leader of Hamas was eliminated.
Indeed. Well, let's turn to Colonel Rayburn. Colonel, what is the strategic objective of Iran in its calculus to currently retaliate, supposedly, even though I don't see this as a retaliation, since it entered into war with Israel long before the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, was killed in its own territory. And to put also things into context, nobody has claimed responsibility for it, and it does not have any proof, concrete proof, nor does it really know what happened and how it happened, to blame Israel. Nonetheless, Israel is easily blamed, and therefore, in that context, how do you see and why does Iran showcase such determination to strike Israel?
Well, Jonathan, you know, I think for the Iranian regime to achieve its objectives in the region around it, it has to be perceived as stronger than it actually is. And so anytime it's hit in such a way that puts it on the back foot or demonstrates a real vulnerability, they have a problem, because their ascendancy or their power overmatch, let's say, in the Arab world in particular, depends on the Arab world's perception that the Iranians are the strongest power in the region, or potentially the strongest power in the region, or at least appear to Israel, Turkey, and so on. And for presumably Israel, although it's not acknowledged, to be able to reach deep into Tehran to carry out a precise assassination attack by whatever means it was carried out, demonstrates Iranian weakness, Iranian vulnerability, something that the Iranians themselves can't do, especially when you match that with a couple of things. First is what was essentially the strategic failure by the Iranian regime on the night of April 13th, 14th, when they failed to do any damage with their massive missile and drone barrage. That was a chink in their armor. That began to deflate the perception of their strength in the region around them, and that hurts the Iranians in material terms in their interactions in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in the Gulf region, in Afghanistan as well. They have to keep up the myth of power. They have to keep up the myth that they're able to move things behind the scenes, as Qasem Soleimani once did, as Mahmoud Mughniya once did. And so they're in a bind right now because they can't let stand the perception that they're unable to respond to this Israeli penetration deep into Iranian territory, the capital. I mean, right into the Revolutionary Guards. We're told, a guest house kind of compound. That's the heart of the regime, the heart of the Revolutionary Guards. So they can't let that stand. But they also know, I think, that they have a more realistic appreciation behind closed doors of the power disparity between themselves and Israel and themselves in the United States. And so they know that if they do something that does actual serious damage to Israel, that they will get more than just a bloody nose. And the kind of things that could happen to them that we've heard talked about, such as maybe they would lose their oil export terminals and so on, are the kind of things that could threaten their regime to collapse ultimately. So you can see that they're hesitant. You can see that they're not quite sure how to proceed. They need to deliver a message to the region around them that they're still strong, that they're not overmatched by Israel and the United States and so on. But they have to calibrate that in such a way that they don't actually go up the escalation ladder in a way that they know they can't match Israel and the United States and others.
Let's talk about this escalation ladder. Escalation dominance keeps taking place in this scenario, and therefore, General Kuperwasser, I'd like to ask you, Israel this morning came out and said if Iran attacks in any capacity, irrespective of the consequences thereof, as it initially stated, Israel will attack disproportionately, quote unquote. What can we learn from this, and to what degree has this resounded, not only in the halls of power in Tehran, but also in those in Washington and other European capitals?
Well, the chances of the prospects of escalation are quite significant at this point. I agree totally with what was said here about the limitations of the Iranian power, but eventually they will come up with some way of action, because this was explained by Joel, it's something that they have to do. Otherwise, they are going to be seen as weak and unable to respond to something that was so painful for them. And because of that, they have to do something, knowing that Israel promises to do something unproportional or disproportional, and knowing that this may lead to escalation. The one problem, the major problem of the Iranians is that the reaction should be successful. They cannot afford repeating the weakness, the weak response that they had in mid-April. That cannot happen. They have to be now much more successful. And they haven't yet found, in my mind, the way that guarantees success. They cannot afford trying to do something and fail. Not only that they're going to be seen as weak, but Israel is going to respond dramatically. So this is terrible. And that's why they gain more time, not in order to avoid doing anything, but in order to find the way to do something successful. Now, this successful thing can be smaller than what some people expect, but it has to be successful. And there's plenty of ways of action that may guarantee success in their mind, not necessarily in reality, but in their mind can guarantee success. And they are, in my mind, considering them, and it's taking time. They were not ready on the day that Haniyeh was assassinated. So they need time in order to prepare something that is going to be successful, that they can prove that they didn't just went away without doing anything. By the way, in the past, several times they did find something that would be painful and show that they are not ready to suffer without a response. And several times the case was just the opposite. They didn't find something like that and they didn't respond. In the case of Zahidi, they launched 350 projectiles towards Israel, and this was something new and that they believed was going to be successful. They failed, but they didn't know that they are going to fail. Remember the Buenos Aires explosions in the 90s? These were attacks that were there in order to respond to all kinds of things that happened with the support of Iran, done by Hezbollah, but with the support and the mastermind of Iran. They did that. And on the other hand, the cases like Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and many other nuclear scientists went by without a response from real response from Iran. It depends. They have to find something that is going to be successful. If they don't do just something in order to be written down as those who responded. Having said that, if they are going to be successful in anything, then Israel was going to respond. And as I said, the chances of escalation are going to be quite significant. Now they're trying to hide behind the idea that, okay, the one thing we want most is for Hamas to stay in power in Gaza. If we manage to reach an agreement that would leave Hamas in power in Gaza, we don't need to respond because we have already won the war. So what the necessity to respond is becoming lesser.
Well, Mr. Oren, I said that already earlier today. I can't find anything I disagree with. So how about you take a shot?
Well, I'm not sure it is correct to depict what happened in mid-April as a total Iranian failure. Of course, it depends on who's doing the depicting, the description here. But they did hit Nevatim Air Base. The fact that no one was hurt, much like in their retaliation for the Qassam Soleimani assassination in January of 2020, when they hit Al-Assad Air Base and several U.S. servicemen suffered from concussions because they took shelter. Of course, anyone can look at it and say whether it's a success or failure. But an Israeli airbase was not hit ever since 1973, right, when the Syrians launched Frog missiles into Ramat David in the north, or in 1967, when the fear of Jordanian artillery hitting Ramat David caused Israel to enter the West Bank or northern Samaria. So I wouldn't put it as a total failure. And if Hezbollah tries to emulate the Nevatim strike by trying to hit Ramat David, as they already struck the command post of the Northern Command, and say, this is what we did in order to retaliate, because they said we will find whoever gave the order to kill Fuad Shukr. So this could be a face-saving measure by both Iran and Hezbollah.
Colonel Rayburn, I must say the quantity of firepower that the United States has diverted to the Middle East, joined by not only 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, but also a third sent here by the Italians. Seeing the amphibious Bathan or USS Bathan with other very strategic weaponry placed at high alert. I mean, the Iranians are scared. I can't imagine that at this point. They understand that whatever they may attempt to do will come at a heavy cost, which I completely agree with what you said earlier. It may come at the cost of their regime. In this calculus, what should the United States do and Israel do in order to capitalize on that scenario?
Well, first of all, a little more of the strategic analysis. I think the Iranian regime is in a position that it didn't imagine it would be in back in October of last year. They're in a much weaker position, but it is the logical culmination of the fact that they can no longer open a southern front against Israel because Hamas has been neutralized so far operationally in Gaza. And so there's only Hezbollah and there's only Iran. I mean, the Houthis can do some damage from Yemen, but not to a decisive degree. And the Iraqi Hashid is a poor substitute for Hamas. So essentially, there's only one major operational proxy group that the Iranians can wield right now in a serious way, and it's one that Hezbollah is like a bee, where the bee can sting you, but it kills itself by doing it because it's dead when the stinger is pulled out. So Hezbollah can only be used once, and if it's used once to its full extent, it will die because Israel will destroy it completely. And that has to be the Iranian calculation here. They don't have another strategic deterrent other than their own missile arsenal and Hezbollah at this stage. The Houthis in Iraq and the Iraqi Hashid and whatever they would have in Syria have proven not to be a substitute for the loss of Hamas or to replicate Hezbollah's capabilities. So the Iranians are in a difficult situation. What's even more difficult, I think, and here we get into what the United States has been doing. I think it was very good that the UK, France, and Germany issued their warnings to the Iranians not to escalate, because the implication there, I think, and what the Iranians have to be fearing is that the European countries and the UK could turn back on enforcement of European sanctions against the Iranian regime, which I think the Iranian regime would be unable to withstand in concert with actual enforced U.S. sanctions. So there's that. They face economic and political isolation from Europe in a way that they have escaped so far, strangely, since October 7th, but they have. In addition to that, I think the Saudi and Jordanian statements saying that they would not allow their airspace to be used to attack anyone, i.e., for attacks against Israel, I think that was also a significant signal to the Iranians that they face actually what the United States weeded out by shooting down last time. And now maybe the Saudis and the Jordanians would multiply, or the same thing as April 13th, 14th could be done again. I think that was the clear signal. What should be done to exploit? Well, to my mind, what the United States should be doing is using these elements of leverage to mobilize essentially an international political coalition to pressure the Iranians, along with all of these other military moves. And they need to describe it that way. They need to say that these different points of leverage add up to a plan, to a strategy, and explain how that works.
General Kuperwasser, is Israel, or I'll define it differently, does Israel have to reach a certain diplomatic solution to include concessions under the plan brought forth by U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein vis-a-vis Lebanon in order to see UN Security Council Resolution 1701 implemented in a projected or amplified manner that would then convince the residents of northern Israel that it is indeed safe to yet again return to their houses in the north of the country?
Well, it's not a necessity, but it's something that can be done. If these concessions are not significant, this can be done. But first of all, we are talking about implementing 1701 in the original sense. So it's not something that we are inventing here. According to 1701, Hezbollah shouldn't have been present south of the Litani. And only the Lebanese army should have been able to deploy over there. So it's something that we are not asking more than what was agreed upon many, many years ago. So I don't think we need to make any concessions. If we want to, if there's anything we realize that's not painful and it's going to save face for somebody, it's not something that I rule out. As long as eventually the population can come back to their communities and live safely. But I think this is not very much in the cards right now. What's more expected is an escalation. That it's going to be difficult because we are not going to accept the Hamas terms for the ceasefire in Gaza. If we are not going to accept that, it means that Hezbollah cannot stop the fighting. And this would mean that eventually when we come from Gaza after something happens there and there's a reason to leave Gaza and to move to the north, we shall have to face Hezbollah. I hope that we shall be able to reach an agreement, but I think the probability is low, and we shall have to fight Hezbollah. And this is what Iran war is about, as Joel explained very well, because this is the only important asset it has. And Israel is going to come with the positive outcome in Gaza. This is something very dangerous. That not only they lost Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, they might lose Hezbollah as well. That's what they worry about. I think in general, what we see is that Iran is extremely dangerous. The way they built this ring of fire around us, their readiness to launch 350 projectiles against us in April, they're extremely dangerous. But they are less capable than what they perceive themselves to be, and they are much more vulnerable than what they perceive themselves to be. And we saw that with the Israeli response in April, and we see it now with the threats of the West, especially the United States, but also the position of Germany, France, and the UK, is a problematic position because on the one hand, there is the fear, as Joel said, that they may resume some of the sanctions if Iran leads to escalation. And secondly, there is the notion that if Iran escalates, we are not going to call Israel to behave if this is the case, and we shall prove or at least understand why it retaliates heavily against you. And especially at this time where the Americans have brought all kinds of offensive weapons, not only defensive, this is something that the Iranians have to take into account. They were proven vulnerable. They know they're vulnerable. And the idea of October 7th was to put Israel under existential threat, not to put the Iranian regime under existential threat. But this may be the end result. And that's why they are so cautious about choosing a way of action that on the one hand will say we are still powerful and we are still capable, but at the same time avoid escalation. It's trying to find a very problematic way out of this complicated situation they're in.
Two entire squadrons, of course, F-22 Raptors, it's important to emphasize this. Two bombers, B-2 bombers, I mean, their capabilities are well known worldwide, and many other tools that have very significant offensive capabilities, a lot of firepower. But we're drawing near to the end of the program, and therefore I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing analysis. Mr. Owen, we'll start with you.
I'm afraid we're not doing full justice to the Israeli position, because there is an obvious internal debate in the upper echelons of the Israeli decision-making group. Both the professional military and security chiefs, as well as the Minister of Defense, believe that the center of gravity should be shifted to the north, and therefore it is not going to be an Israeli concession to have a ceasefire in Gaza, which will entail the return of at least 30-odd hostages alive, but it will be to Israel's benefit. Now, of course, there is the other view, which is articulated by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but there is quite a body of opinion supported by the military and the Minister of Defense, who is a political figure, to the other side of the equation.
Indeed, of course, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant had an elaborate discussion about this at the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, during the course of which the chairman of that committee, Yuli Edelstein, highlighted that there is a discussion about the priorities, and both sides have solid arguments that need to be deliberated. Colonel Rayburn, you have 1 minute.
Well, I think at this stage, actually, it's time to start thinking more broadly about what needs to be done in the region to roll back the causes of instability once and for all. I think it is a good time to be talking about what the future should entail, not just for Gaza, but for the Palestinian question. But I don't think that shouldn't be the centerpiece of foreign policy thinking and diplomacy going forward. But there should be something, I think, concrete, articulated. It's still not clear, for example, even at this stage, who would actually, if there were a ceasefire and if there were a phased Israeli military withdrawal, who would actually be running Gaza other than the remnants of Hamas who would come out from the tunnels and so on. That's not acceptable to anybody, and that would also collapse a ceasefire. So I think there has to be some real concrete thinking done, and more publicly, to get people used to the idea about what that would entail. But there also needs to be a broader talk about what to do about the problem of the Iranian regime. If you get to a point where the guns stop firing, what needs to be done about this Iranian regime problem going forward? And no one who's actually in power right now is doing that.
General Kuperwasser?
Yeah, I agree that the most important thing right now is to focus on Gaza. And what's going to happen in Gaza is going to determine what's going to happen in the other arenas. There is this debate that Amir was referring to. I'm of the opinion of the Prime Minister in this respect, but I respect the opinion of the other side. I think that if we leave Hamas in power, it's going to be a success for the entire Iranian axis. And if we don't, then the domino effect is going to be very dangerous for the Iranian axis, and we should make sure that this is going to happen.
It's important to note that the Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah articulated in his last speech the fact that in an effort to try and explain to his supporters why Hezbollah is in that war, why hundreds of its operatives have been killed, and that is in order to ensure that Hamas is preserved, something, of course, that, according to him, unless it is preserved, will bring about devastating consequences to the region. From his perspective, of course, to the Iran-led axis, something that we hope that would not take place, of course, in a situation where the Iranians would have the upper hand. But this is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank General Kuperwasser, Colonel Rayburn, and Mr. Owen for all of your insights, and I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.